Caledonian McBrain and the Big Light present
We've explored the quiet corners of the soul and the physical rush of the peaks. But beneath the heather and the waves lies a different kind of energy, the weight of thousands of years of human story. In the Hebrides, history isn't something tucked away in a glass case in a museum. It's written in the dry stone dikes, whispered in the Gaelic place names, and carved into the very cliffs that greet the Calmac ferries every morning. Welcome to Scottish Island Adventures. I'm Tony Kearney. My family home is the island of Barra, and I just love Scotland's west coast islands. Their people, wildlife and history. This season, we're welcoming guests who will help you get the most out of your next visit to the Western Isles. To help us peel back the layers of the past, I'm joined by a man who lives and breathes the stories of Scotland. He's an award-winning presenter, a champion of the Scots language, and a tour guide who can make a pile of ancient stones feel like a living, breathing neighbourhood. Known to his thousands of social media followers as Historic Ali, I'm thrilled to welcome Alistair Heather to the show. Alistair, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Great to have you along. I'm so keen to chat to you because I just love history, and you really do bring history alive. Alistair, what is it in particular that draws you to the history of the islands?
Well, I am originally from about as far away from the islands as you can get in Scotland. I'm from the east coast, a little sort of Scots language village called Newbiggin, and so my history was very different to the history of the Isles, but together we made the history of Scotland. It was when the history of the Isles and the history of the East Coast came together as part of that national story through things like the Battle of Bannockburn, when we all met, fought alongside, and we became this multilingual kingdom that the story of Scotland really began. So as I got older, as I got more and more interested in history, I knew I needed to understand that distinct Gaelic, Norse, Hebridean tradition of history if I was going to have any idea what this modern Scotland is all about.
So to get that comprehensive view, you've gone west to find out more, and you have spent your career really uncovering the grit of Scottish history, because it's not like Brigadoon. There's a lot of grit in there, isn't there? Why do the islands then feel like such a unique kind of time capsule compared perhaps with the history of the cities and their hustle and their bustle?
It's a great question. I think for visitors to places like Dundee, where I live, for example, it was a city that was a big medieval place, and it got destroyed on a couple of big invasions, and then it industrialised. So a lot of that ancient history got kind of ploughed under, it got concreted over, they got big buildings on top of it, and a lot of that history is just not as visible. But when you go to the Hebrides or places like it, often the layers that different generations have laid down are still there, they're still visible. You can go to the place, you can touch the stone, you can see the remnants of a palace, you can see the remnants of a castle, you can hear these place names that are laid down 400 years ago in the local dialect that tell you the rich history of place. When I go to Islay, for example, which I love to go to, heading there in May for the Fèis Islay, the Islay Whisky Festival, there's so much of Scotland's history there that you can just go and look at, and it's quiet and it's peaceful. For example, can I tell you about my favourite place in Islay?
Yeah, please do.
So if you guys, the listeners, are coming to Islay, then check out Finlaggan. It's a very small, kind of ruined great hall on an island in the middle of a loch in the middle of Islay. And this is the heartbeat of the old kind of lordship of the Isles. So when Scotland was in infancy in the 13, 14, 1500s, the King of Scotland, who was based out in Stirling or Edinburgh or Dunfermline, couldn't really have any power in the Hebrides. So he had to get locals who were willing to act on his behalf. And the lords of the Isles basically ran the Hebrides as their private fiefdom. And from this little building, Finlagan, is where all of the different heads of the clans of all of the Hebrides would gather to discuss the laws, to discuss the feuds, to feast, to party, and to basically make deals that would hold the whole culture of Gaeldom together. And you can just go there. There's a beautiful boardwalk. It's a nice sort of natural environment with all the reeds and birds and this amazing loch. And the best thing is you get it largely to yourself. It's a stunning place that takes you right to the heart of the Hebridean story.
Well, that sounds absolutely fascinating. The Lordship of the Isles. And of course, we have the Calmac Ferry, the Lord of the Isles. We know now where that gets its name from. You talked about there, Alistair, about, finding out about the history in the dialect, in the native dialect of each place. And I know that you are a passionate advocate for our native languages. In the islands, of course, the landscape is so deeply tied to the Gaelic language, and in the north and in the east we have the Scots language. How do these languages act as a kind of map for understanding, if you like, the people who walked these shores 1,000 years ago?
Well, I do think so. They tell you about how people used the land. And so one of the distilleries out in Islay, Lagavulin, that means the hollow of the mill. And that tells you that the community that was there built up around a mill. That tells you that they were farming people who were right down by the water, who would grind their grain there and then sail it out to the rest of the world. And that immediately takes you into the worldview and the experience of the people that lived there. You might think of Islay as remote, but even when that name was laid down, it wasn't remote. They had a mill, they had a bay, and it connected them to the wider world. Or right next to Lagavulin is Duniveg Castle. And that is the fort of the galleys, or the fort of the ships. And that tells us that in the Gaelic-speaking kind of heyday of the Lordship of the Isles, that was his naval centre. That's where the galleys of the Lord of the Isles were kept. And so today, you have this really iconic ruin on this cliff top just outside of Lagavulin. But because of that name, Duniveg, you can just re-inhabit it with your imagination. This is where the Lord kept his navy. And just let your imagination go from there.
So they are really a window into the past and an explanation for us, aren't they? The native languages. You talked about going to the islands and you're able to touch a stone. We can think of Keesmel Castle in Barra, the only medieval castle in the Western Isles. And of course, there's the standing stones in Callanish or on the west coast of Lewis. You've mentioned Islay, but let's explore that a bit further. For a traveller hopping off the ferry for the first time, is there for you any other sort of hidden historical sites like a broch or a black house or a forgotten fort that kind of still gives you goosebumps every time you see it?
Well, I do think that in Islay, there's a couple of big historical visits that people will go to, but there is, just out the back of Beaumore, is a massive standing stone just in somebody's field. No interpretation panel, no information, but it must be 4 metres high. And it's got beautiful quartz through it. And I think that's indicative. Often quartz is used in standing stones because we think that our ancient ancestors saw quartz, that lovely shining white stone, as light caught in the act of turning to stone. They believed it was a way of mediating between the sky and the gods and the stone, the land. And so they thought quartz was fundamentally holy. So right out the back of Beaumore, you can stroll there in 12 minutes from the ferry terminal. You have this massive standing stone that is in communication with the landscape around it. You can see all around from there, and it's in a lovely little hollow. So you can put yourself there. Again, you'll get it to yourself, and you can just inhabit the same space of serious significance to our ancestors and just meditate upon it. And just on the Callanish stones and on this amazing standing stone, I'd always wondered how they managed to get them into position, because these things weigh 20, 30, 40 tons easy, 100 tons sometimes. And so they've experimented heavily, and they believe that they laid a slick of kelp, of seaweed, from the shore right the way to the site and would drag the stones across this kelp mattress because it's so slippery. You must have kelped on kelp in your time.
Yeah, we all have had a good slip in the kelp.
Exactly. And so that knowledge and that standing stone in situ tells you so much about how much it mattered to people that they'd build this big kelp motorway all the way down the hill and drag that stone up. And it's another way of understanding the past, because a lot of the islands aren't densely populated. And so a great way to commune with the people who live there now and who have lived there is through place names. It's through these stones that are legacies in the landscape.
That is absolutely fascinating. You're really painting a picture for us there. I did not know that about the kelp, and I didn't know that about 15 minutes from the ferry terminal in Beauvoir. There is a lone standing stone I need to go and visit. I want to talk a little bit about oral tradition, Alistair, because you are a storyteller at heart. I'm wondering how much of island heritage is found in the official archives, if you like, and how much is still held in the oral traditions that are told and are passed down generation to generation, and sometimes they're told in a pub over a dram.
You're so right. There's always that dichotomy between the kind of the official history, what gets written down, and then what is transmitted through the communities. And the islands has an amazing official history. Through the Lordship of the Isles, you do have these great books of law acts. So that's there. And you get amazing museums like on Lismore. There's a great museum community centre. But a lot of the best chat I've got is from like taxi drivers, folk that have retired to the pub, lassies working at the co-op that are telling you about the ghosts that haunt the hotel you've just checked into. And they're completely convinced that it's there, and if you're in room number 8, you're getting haunted. And the stories from the whiskey industry, for example, they tell them well at the distillery, but you don't get that lived feeling like you get from somebody who humphed the barrels up and down for decades, who has a real living understanding. Even to Eriskay, for example, there is still the Prince's Beach. I won't butcher the Gaelic, but the Prince's Beach in Eriskay is absolutely gorgeous. But that name is connected to where Bonnie Prince Charlie landed, and that name records that folk memory. But more than that, there's a type of flower, ragwort, that grows on the beach there. And the local tradition around that flower is it's a French native flower that was brought over by that ship that landed when Bonnie Prince Charlie and his 7 followers landed from France. They brought some seed with them in the soles of their shoes or the folds of their cloaks, and it landed on that beach and spreads only there in Eriskay. And it's a folk memory tied to the landscape, to the natural world. And that's the storytelling that isn't tethered to a museum. It's tethered to the things that really matter to people of the land.
Okay, now you're giving me goosebumps. That's incredible. I didn't know that, and I've been on that beach in Eriskay, Try, Ifteumsa, the Prince's Beach. Fascinating living history. My memory of the islands is often being with my granny and taking eggs to someone from the hen house, and then you would get fish back. It was kind of like a barter system, if you like. And I'm wondering, today, do you think, Alistair, is there still this kind of specific social history in the islands where everyone looks out for one another? And does that, legendary island hospitality that we hear about, does that stem from the historical necessity of surviving, perhaps, in such a wild and in such a rugged landscape?
Well, I do think that the Gaelic tradition comes from a very different tradition to, like, the Norman tradition, for example, which was hierarchical and was based around capital and, like, exchange. I do think that the Gaelic tradition, and you see that through the poetry, through the music, there's a communality. Like, you've been to a good céilí. A céilí to an English speaker or a Scots speaker is a formal dance with a band. And you do it at a wedding. And it's great crack, and I really enjoy it. But in the Gaelic, as you know well yourself, a céilí is much more about a coming together where folks share. And that you can have a wee céilí around the house that is like basically sharing chat over a cup of tea, and there's a bit of conversation, a bit of storytelling. Maybe somebody brings a fiddle, maybe it gets out of hand and somebody brings a bottle. But a céilí, it's much more about the coming together. And I think the core of understanding Gaelic culture is that it wasn't transactional. The Lord of the Isles was by no means wealthy like a French lord might be, but he had tremendous status within his community, and that was about the obligations that he had as well as the power he had. So I think that communality you see in the history books is still so there in the way that people treat each other in the islands. Like, just for example, I know that when we were organising the Isla Whiskey Festival, the only coffee machine broke. And the call just went out around the island, and a cafe just closed for the day to donate us their coffee machine to make sure that the whole thing could keep going, because everyone wanted it to be a success, and they wanted people coming over, having a good time. And I think that communality does overrun other concerns, like the capital exchange.
It's not reduced to an economic calculus at all.
Exactly.
You're talking about the Lord of the Isles there, Alistair, and it makes me think, back in the day, people were using the waterways like we would perhaps use the motorways today, weren't they? That was the mode of communication.
Can I please introduce you to my favourite word, and it is relevant here. It's thassalocracy.
Oh.
A thassalocracy is a kingdom which is all based on control of the waterways. And the Lord of the Isles ran a thassalocracy. So thrill your friends with that great word. Finlagan was the centre of the thassalocracy. It's from the Greek for something, water, something. And I believe. And that's the sense you get when you're in Islay. Because if you drive around Islay, it's still quite bumpy roads. If you go out to Lismore, it's not the easiest place to drive around. A lot of places need four-wheel drives at least to move around. But the seas are quite, as Calmac passengers will know, they're actually quite calm. There's a lot of protection around from other islands. You can sail around. You can move by boat far easier than you can move by land. And once you reinterpret the water as a motorway and the land as a blockage to movement, you really understand how communities lived around these different islands.
Well, let's unpack that a little bit further then. Do you think that the evolution of the ferry service today has maybe changed the way we now connect with our heritage? Does it make the past more accessible? Or, conversely, does it change the mystery?
I do think that if you fly to an island, which is absolutely fine, like people need to go quickly to and fro, you don't get the same sense of place and the sense of understanding how a place really ticks. I think you need to catch a ferry between the islands to understand how the place evolved, its relationship to the wider world, and how the mentality and culture of the islands exists. And also, a lot of the people listening to this, I presume, will be travelling there to go and explore, to get to know the place better. You need time to do that. And the time it takes for you to see the islands in the distance, to approach them, to explore the coastlines with your eyes, to see the lighthouses, it gives you a much better understanding of where you are. So I think if you have the time, always take the ferry. And it does connect you with how these places related to the wider world.
Yes, it does give you that time to kind of process and switch off, doesn't it? The journey as the islands loom into sight. So, Alistair, if you were writing a history hunter's handbook for a visitor today, which specific island would you tell them to start with to truly feel, the bones of Scotland's story?
That's an incredible question. And the great thing about the islands, I would say, is you could pick just about any one and unpack Scotland's story there, because as much as they've been themselves and insular, all of Scotland has lived through them too. So you could pick Bute, and you could go way back to the early medieval period and the Gaelic kingdoms, and you could see Norse influence there. Or you can jump forward to the likes of Mount Stewart, and you've got Scotland right in the midst of the British Empire and connections to coal mines in Wales and land interests in Australia and all these kind of great grand schemes. And I think you could do that with just about anywhere in the Hebrides. You could look at the earliest faint traces of the ancestors landing on the Machar for the first time. And then you could look right up to the modern age. The whole world is contained in these islands, which makes it such a pleasure to go and get to know them.
You've touched on something there which I think is absolutely fascinating about the islands, and a lot of the place names give away the Norse influence there. You think about the discovery of the Oog chessmen on a beach on the west coast of Lewis. One of the world's great archaeological stories. In your view, Alistair, how does a find like that redefine the Western Isles, not as a remote edge of the world, but as this kind of central highway for the Vikings and for North Atlantic trade routes?
I think that there's a great expression in history, which is turn the map. So often we see our islands from a London-centric, because London's the big thing and everything points away from that and seems like a fringe. If you just turn the map, you see how close the Hebrides are on this great highway between Ireland, Isle of Man, the Wales, the Hebrides, and then the Scandinavian regions further north. It is a great highway, and it was completely lived in like that. And it is the ferries that keep us connected to that kind of heritage. But I think understanding that in the 1100s, the Hebrides invaded Scotland. Like under descendants of Somerled, one of the first Lords of the Isles, maybe the first Lord of the Isles, there was a great organisation of Hebrideans to come and invade Scotland and try and take a whole load of the mainland away from the Kingdom of Scotland. And Malcolm IV had to go and give battle to get the Hebrideans off. So the idea that it's the edge of anywhere is completely incorrect. It's its own centre. And that's why I said at the top of the programme, to understand Scotland's history, you can't just understand the James Kings based out of Stirling. You can't just understand, like, Aberdeen's trade with the Germans. You need to go to the Hebrides and appreciate that it was a Gaelic and Norse cultural space, which was very contested, had its own rulers, its own laws, and its own ways of doing things.
And of course, we can't forget that population goes back there to the Bronze Age, doesn't it? They're always having these archaeological digs and finding such interesting and fascinating artefacts. We've talked a little bit about the Callanish standing stones. I suppose I just want to tap into your expert knowledge a little bit more. 5,000 years ago, you've told us that they were dragged there on a bed of kelp, which is just, mind-blowing and incredible. What were the people doing? If we were to go back 5,000 years ago, what kind of scene do you think we would be witnessing at the Callanish stones and standing stones of that like throughout the Hebrides?
We would go back, and on the big high days of the year, Beltane, that kind of thing, we would be in the midst of a great ceilidh. We know that there were relatively low populations based on what we'd think of today, moving in big clan groups of a few hundred. There'd be a lot of hunting and gathering. There'd be a lot of, going quite far away to hunt and then coming back to your lands. We don't know exactly what the belief systems around the stones were, but we know that people needed a reason to get back together because we're such a social bunch. And so the stones gave us a centre. It gave us a place to return to. All the families that are scattered all across the islands would return to these great big centres for feasting. We would feast, we'd have fun, we'd see old friends, we'd stay up all night with great big bonfires, and it would be tremendous crack. If me and you got the chance to nip back for 24 hours, we would have a ball. I'd say the 1st of May, Callanish standing stones, bring a bottle, bring a fiddle, it's going to be a great night.
Let's go. I'm booking that ferry from Ullapool to Stornoway. Haven't been to the Stones for many's a long year, but after listening to you today, Alistair, I really want to go back. Finally then, where next? What's your next big Scottish island adventure, Alistair?
Let me tell you, and I can't wait, I'm finally going to Barra.
Oh, yeah. Good for you.
Yeah, never been. I've always wanted to go. My granddad's first girlfriend was from Barra. He was from the Gorbals in Glasgow, and he was an apprentice painter, a 14-year-old, in one of the big houses in the West End. He was painting one of the houses there, and he was working under his head painter, his journeyman painter, and the lady of the house came in and said, "Painter, your apprentice must take my servant out for the cinema at the weekend." And that's how the date was organised. And the servant girl was a 14-year-old lass, Faye Barra, who barely spoke a peep of English and was extremely shy. But They went on a couple of wee dates out to the pictures. My granddad said he went along in his granddad's bonnet because it was the smartest bonnet in the house, and he said it was like a dustbin lid on his head. But they went on a bunch of dates, and then she had to go back to Barra to look after her ageing father. And my granddad sent loads of letters out to Barra and things. He was very happily married to my granny and stuff, but that was his only ever sweetheart, and he never went to Barra, and he always wondered what life was like out there for her, what the life was like for the people of Barra. So I'm going to go and see what the crack is and see if I can track down the ancestors of my granddad's first girlfriend.
Oh, that's beautiful. You're going to close that circle. I'm of course biased, Alistair, and it is the jewel of the Hebrides. Thank you so much for chatting with us today. I could listen to you all day. Alistair, it's been really fascinating. Thank you.
Oh, you're very kind. Thank you so much for having me on.
That's all for this episode of Scottish Island Adventures. Please subscribe, like, rate and review and share with your friends. We'll be dropping new episodes every fortnight, full of great conversations with fantastic guests from the worlds of wellness, whisky, wildlife, heritage and more. Book your Caledonian McBrain Island adventure now. For show notes and more information, plus full details on Caledonian McBrain's routes, timetables, prices and bookings, go to calmac.co.uk. You've been listening to Scottish Island Adventures with me, Tony Kearney. It was written and produced by Michael Wilson Park, with engineering and mastering by Brian McAlpine for The Big Light. The executive producer was Fiona White.
From the Big Light Studio.